It didn't happen all at once, you know? It's like when the weather slowly changes. One day, it's warm and sunny, and the next, it's cloudy and cold. That's how Amina and I started to drift. At first, I thought it was just the stress of life weighing on her, or maybe the long hours I was working at the shawarma stand. Business was slow, and I had to pick up extra shifts just to keep the bills paid. It was tough, but I figured she understood. We were building something together, right? But something shifted in her. Amina started getting more distant. She'd sit across from me at dinner, her eyes glued to her phone, barely saying a word. I thought maybe it was just the stress. I mean, we didn't have much to show for all our hard work, and I knew it bothered her. We weren't the couple we used to be, laughing over takeout at 2 a.m., talking about dreams we had for the future. Now, it was just silence, and her checking her phone constantly. I tried not to let it bother me at first. After all, we were both dealing with our own stuff, right? But then it started to feel like more. She'd roll her eyes when I talked about the restaurant, or worse, she wouldn't even listen. Sometimes she'd get upset over the smallest things. A miscommunication, a joke that wasn't funny, me forgetting to pick up something from the store. It was like she wasn't the same woman I married. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping away from me. I remember one night, things really exploded. We were arguing about money, again. I'd been working late all week, barely home, trying to keep things afloat, and she was frustrated. I could see it in her eyes. It wasn't just about the bills or the restaurant. There was something deeper eating at her, but she wouldn't say it. I tried to keep calm, but she snapped. "Don't you get it, Omar? This is not the life I signed up for," she yelled, throwing her hands up in the air. I was stunned. I hadn't heard her talk like that in a long time. "I'm doing the best I can," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "What do you want me to do?" "I'm working my ass off." She shook her head. "You're always working. You never listen to me. It's like I'm invisible." That stung. It hit me in the chest harder than I expected. But instead of addressing it, I just got quiet. I didn't know what else to say. I felt like I was losing her, and I didn't know how to fix it. She looked at me, a mixture of frustration and disappointment in her eyes, before she stormed out of the room. A few hours later, she told me she was going out with some of her friends. I didn't think much of it, even though she hadn't mentioned anything before. But that night, something felt off. It felt like she was running away from me, like she didn't want to deal with whatever was happening between us. It was around midnight when she left. I was still up, trying to figure out how to fix things, when she texted me, "I'm going to the restaurant to talk to Hassan. I need to clear my head." I didn't think much of it. Hassan had always been polite, but he was distant with her, just like he was with me. We'd never really spoken much, except when I'd pick up supplies or talk business. I figured she just needed someone to listen. She was upset, and he was the one who was around. But in hindsight, that was the first crack in the wall. The night Amina went to the restaurant to talk to Hassan, I had no idea what was coming. She'd been so angry with me earlier, the argument still hanging between us like a heavy cloud. She slammed the door behind her, saying she needed to get out of the house, clear her head. I figured she just needed space. Maybe a break from all the stress, the constant money troubles, and the pressure of me working all those late shifts at the shawarma stand. When she texted me, saying she was going to Hassan's place to vent, I didn't think much of it. Hassan had always been polite but distant when I was around. He'd never shown any interest in Amina, not like that. He was always too businesslike, too cold. I'd never gotten the sense that he even liked her much. So when she said she was going to talk to him, I thought it was just the kind of thing people did when they were frustrated. You go to the one person who isn't too close to you, someone who doesn't judge, just listens. But deep down, something didn't sit right with me. Hassan wasn't the type to be that interested in anyone's personal life. He wasn't warm enough for that. Still, I didn't want to make a big deal of it. She was just venting. I trusted her. Later, when she came home, she didn't mention much about the conversation with Hassan. I figured it was a typical, "we talked, he listened" type of thing. Amina didn't even seem that shaken up by it. But there was something in her tone, something guarded, like she was holding back. She didn't ask how my night went, didn't sit down with me like she normally did after a shift. She just kissed me goodnight and retreated to the bedroom. And then I saw the phone. It was just a glance really, but I couldn't help noticing the way she was holding it. Always turned away, always glancing at it when she thought I wasn't looking. I told myself it was nothing. She was probably tired, and we were both on edge. But that little seed of doubt had been planted. The next day, I noticed it again. Her phone, hidden face down, her eyes darting to it every few minutes. The change was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't fully present anymore, not in the way she used to be. I tried to ignore it, tell myself it was nothing. But then I started hearing things. Small things, like the way she mentioned Hassan's name more casually in conversation. Yeah, Hassan said I should take a few days off, get away, she'd mention over dinner, a little too casually. At first, I didn't question it. But then, the more I thought about it, the more I realized, why was she talking about Hassan like that? I wasn't stupid. I knew something had shifted. But what could I do? I was working late. I couldn't afford to take time off. I had a family to feed. A part of me wanted to confront her, ask what was really going on, but I didn't want to be that guy, the one who doubted his wife over nothing. I wanted to trust her. I had to. But with every passing day, the nagging feeling grew stronger. It wasn't something Amina told me outright. Not at first. It wasn't like one day she came home and said, "I'm having an affair with Hassan." No, it was a slow burn. An accumulation of little choices, small moments where I wasn't looking, where she was slipping further away. Looking back, I can see it now, the way she started dressing differently, more put together when she went out. I'd never really paid attention to those things before, but now I saw the small changes. She was wearing the kind of clothes she'd never put on when we were just the two of us. When I asked her about it, she'd just say, "It's nothing. Just wanted to look nice for a change." But I didn't buy it. Deep down, I knew something was changing. Still, I didn't have proof. I was at the stand, working long shifts just to keep us afloat. I was too tired to piece it all together, and part of me, I think, was too afraid to face it. The first time I really knew, though, it was when she came home late one night, her lipstick smudged, her hair out of place. I didn't say anything then, but it hit me all at once. This was different. She tried to act normal, as if nothing was wrong. But when she kissed me that night, it wasn't the same. There was no warmth in it. No connection. She pulled away too quickly, like she was trying to hide something, and I could smell his cologne. That sickeningly sweet scent lingered on her neck, and I knew. It was like a slap to the face. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to confront her just yet, not without proof. I wasn't ready to admit what was happening. Maybe part of me hoped I was wrong. But the truth is, I wasn't. It wasn't long after that when I found out the full extent of it. I came home one day to find Amina talking on the phone in the other room. I could only hear her side of the conversation, but the words hit me like a punch. "I know, Hassan. I want to be with you too. But it's just so complicated right now." I froze. I should have interrupted, should have barged in and demanded answers, but I didn't. I couldn't. I didn't want to hear it. I went to the kitchen and tried to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But that moment, those words, they stuck with me. I spent the whole night trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood. Maybe she was talking about something else. But deep down I knew. Amina wasn't just talking about work, or about life. She was talking about him. And that's when I realized, this wasn't just some late-night venting session. This wasn't just a one-off. Amina had crossed a line. She was having an affair with Hassan. The worst part. I wasn't even angry at first. I felt numb, like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I just wanted to fix it, but I didn't know how. And so, I let it simmer. I let the pain build, hoping it would somehow go away. I wasn't ready to face it, not yet. But I knew, everything had changed. And now, I had to figure out how to deal with it. The days after I found out, I walked around like a man with a weight on his chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, even though Amina tried her best to pretend everything was normal. She'd give me these half-hearted smiles and act like she was still the woman I married, but I could see the cracks, even if I didn't want to admit it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The way she'd look at her phone when I was around, the nervous glances when she thought I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't just paranoia. There was something in her eyes, something she wasn't telling me, and the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. It started small. I'd come home after a late shift, and Amina would be sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand, her expression tense. When I walked in, she'd quickly put it down, almost too quickly. Her hand would linger on the screen for just a moment longer than normal, like she was hiding something. I'd tell myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just checking work emails or something, but a part of me knew better. I wasn't stupid. Then there were the meetings she started having. Sometimes, she'd leave the house in the middle of the day, telling me it was for work. But I noticed the times never added up. The meetings didn't fit into her usual schedule, and whenever I asked about them, she'd give me a vague answer that didn't quite make sense. Just some stuff at the office. You wouldn't understand, Omar, she'd say, brushing me off. At first, I let it slide. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who was always questioning his wife. But the more I saw her slipping away, the more I started to wonder if I was the fool. I didn't want to face it, but I had to admit to myself, she was hiding something from me. It was on a Wednesday evening when I got a text from Samir that shook me. I just saw Mom's car outside Hassan's restaurant. But she wasn't inside. She was sneaking out from the back. She looked weird, Dad. Like she was trying to hide. I felt like I'd been slapped. The blood drained from my face as I read the message again. Samir didn't exaggerate. He wasn't one to make up stories. I called him immediately, but he was already heading inside, and I could hear the concern in his voice when he said, "She saw me and drove off fast." "I don't know, Dad. It just didn't seem right." I should have confronted her right then, but something inside me hesitated. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, that maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for it all. Maybe she'd just been meeting a colleague. Maybe she was helping Hassan with something work-related. But deep down I knew. The doubt was gnawing at me. I decided to keep quiet for the time being. I didn't want to start a fight without knowing for sure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Samir had seen something real. Something I didn't want to face. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about that moment. Amina sneaking out of the back of the restaurant, trying to hide from her own son. It was all too clear now. Something was going on, and I was the last to know. The next morning, I had a choice to make. I could go to Amina and confront her, or I could wait. But in my gut, I knew the truth. I didn't need to ask. I needed to see for myself. So, after my shift, I decided to drive over to Hassan's restaurant. The doubt in my mind had already turned into certainty. Now, I just needed to confirm it. I don't know what I was expecting when I pulled up outside Hassan's restaurant that night. Maybe I thought I was wrong. Maybe I thought I'd get there, see nothing, and breathe a sigh of relief. But the moment I saw Amina's car parked outside in the dark, I knew I wasn't going to be able to lie to myself anymore. I sat in my car, just staring at it. The parking lot was mostly empty, just her car, sitting there in the shadows. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that maybe she was just helping Hassan with something work-related, like she said. But the knot in my stomach was growing tighter with every passing second. I waited. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I waited long enough, I'd see her come out, and maybe she'd have a perfectly innocent explanation. Maybe it would make sense. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to realize that if I stayed there much longer, I'd have to face what I didn't want to admit. Then, I saw her. Amina came out the back door of the restaurant, laughing. My heart dropped. The sound of her laugh cut through the night, and it felt like a slap in the face. She wasn't alone. Hassan was with her. His arm was around her shoulders, and she leaned into him like she was comfortable, like she belonged there. I couldn't move. I was frozen. My eyes followed them as they walked down the alley, chatting like old friends. At one point, she even touched his arm, her hand resting on his sleeve for just a moment. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And then, just like that, they were gone. They disappeared into the night, Amina's car pulling out of the parking lot before I even had a chance to process what I'd just seen. I sat there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. What was I supposed to do? Confront her now, after I'd seen them together? I wanted to scream, to pound my fists on the dashboard, but I didn't. I stayed still. I don't even remember how I drove home that night. Everything felt like a blur. When I walked into the house, Amina was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. She didn't even say a word. I didn't say anything either. What could I say? But when I lay down next to her, I could feel the distance between us like a chasm. I couldn't touch her. I couldn't even look at her. She wasn't the woman I married anymore. She was someone else, someone I didn't know. The worst part. I didn't even have to confront her. I didn't need to hear her lie anymore. I already knew. The silence between us was all the confirmation I needed. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, turning over the images of Amina and Hassan walking out together, laughing, touching. I kept replaying it over and over, trying to make sense of it. trying to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness. But deep down I knew. There was no way around it. My wife was having an affair. The next morning, she was up before me, already getting ready for work. She didn't look at me when I walked into the kitchen, her eyes glued to her phone, like she was trying to avoid me. I didn't say anything at first, just made my coffee, my mind still a mess. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I dropped the coffee cup on the counter with a clink that startled her. She looked up wide-eyed, as if she wasn't sure whether I was angry or just confused. But I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. "You're sleeping with him, aren't you?" I said, my voice rough. It wasn't even a question. I wasn't asking for confirmation anymore. I already knew the answer. She froze, her face going pale. For a second, I thought she might deny it, say it was all in my head. But instead, she just looked at me, eyes darting away as she tried to gather herself. "Omar, please. Don't please me," I cut her off, the anger bubbling up, hot and bitter. "I saw you last night. Don't lie to me." Her eyes went wide, and for a split second, I saw fear in them. But then she quickly masked it, putting on that same defensive face she'd worn so many times over the past few months. "You don't understand, okay?" Amina's voice was shaky, but she was trying to sound calm. "It's not what you think. I'm just trying to find a way out of all this. It's not working with us, Omar. You're working all the time, and I'm stuck here. I need something more. You don't get it." I stared at her, speechless for a moment. She was actually saying it out loud, like it was my fault for not giving her what she needed. Like I was the one who drove her to this. "You're blaming me for your lies now?" I said, my voice tight, fighting back the rush of emotions that threatened to swallow me whole. "You couldn't come to me, Amina. You couldn't talk to me about what was wrong, about what you wanted. No, instead, you go behind my back and sleep with my boss." Her face flushed with anger, and she stood up, hands on her hips. "I didn't sleep with him, okay? But yes, I've been spending time with him. Hassan gets me. He listens to me. He's not like you. He sees me, Omar." I wanted to yell at her, to make her understand how much she just hurt me, but I couldn't. I couldn't even bring myself to speak for a moment. "Is this why you've been acting like this?" I asked, my voice cracking. "This is why you've been so distant? You've been sneaking around behind my back and you couldn't even look me in the eye?" Amina didn't answer right away. She just stood there, arms crossed, her face hardening. "I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to make you see me anymore," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're always working, Omar. I feel like I don't even exist in your world." So when he started paying attention to me, I felt seen. I felt like I mattered again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was blaming me, saying I wasn't enough for her. The man who had worked day in and day out, busting my back at that damn shawarma stand just to keep us afloat. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I felt a wave of disgust, not just for what she'd done, but for the way she was trying to make me feel guilty for it. Like this was somehow my fault. "You're unbelievable, Amina," I said quietly, the hurt in my voice thickening. "You betray me, and now you're blaming me for it? You could have talked to me. You could have communicated with me, but instead, you throw it all away. For him." She didn't say anything. She just stared at me with those same sad eyes, and for a second, I thought maybe there was a glimmer of regret in them. But it wasn't enough. It was too late. "I don't know who you are anymore," I muttered, shaking my head. "And I don't know if I even care to find out." Amina didn't respond. She just stood there, the silence between us suffocating. It was a silence I couldn't bear anymore. She didn't get it. She didn't understand the depth of the betrayal. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the woman I married. She was someone else now. Someone I couldn't recognize. And that was when I made up my mind. I wasn't going to fight for her anymore. It was over. She had already left me in every way that mattered. I don't know what I expected from Amina after that conversation. Maybe I thought she'd break down and apologize. Maybe I hoped she'd realize what she'd done and come back to me, begging for forgiveness. But all she did was stand there, looking at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I couldn't shake the image of her leaving that restaurant with Hassan, laughing like nothing mattered. It kept playing in my mind, a loop that wouldn't stop. And as much as I wanted to confront her more, demand the truth, I realized I didn't need to ask any more questions. I knew. But still, there was that gnawing feeling. There was still a part of me that didn't want to accept it, that didn't want to believe the woman I loved could betray me so completely. That night, after Amina went to bed, I found myself driving again. I didn't know where I was going at first. I just needed to get out of the house, out of the suffocating silence that seemed to fill every room. I ended up in the parking lot outside Hassan's restaurant again, like it was some kind of instinct. I sat there for a while, just watching the dim lights flicker through the windows, seeing the faint silhouettes of people moving inside. I wondered if Amina was still there, if she'd slipped in while I wasn't looking. Or maybe she was home, already lying in bed, pretending everything was normal. But it didn't matter. The truth was clear now. Even if I hadn't seen them together that night, even if I hadn't followed her, I knew. The lies, the secrecy, the sudden distance, she had already made her choice. I wasn't going to confront her again. Not right now. I'd seen everything I needed to see. But I knew I couldn't just let this go. I sat in the car for a long time, the cold air biting at my skin, and I started thinking about what to do next. I wasn't going to give Amina the satisfaction of knowing how much I was hurting. She'd already taken so much from me, and I wasn't about to give her the power to destroy me completely. I was done. But the real question was, what was I going to do about it? I knew the answer now. And it wasn't about confronting her again. It wasn't about begging for answers that she wasn't going to give. It was about something bigger, something that would make her feel the weight of what she'd done. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her get away with it. I wanted revenge. And not the petty, shouting at each other kind. I wanted to hit them where it hurt. Emotionally, socially, professionally. I wanted to ruin the perfect little world they'd built for themselves. I wasn't just going to let her get away with this without consequences. That night, as I sat in the car, I made a decision. I wasn't going to burn everything down in one angry outburst. I wasn't going to shout or cry or beg. I was going to take my time, be methodical, and make sure every piece of their lives came crashing down slowly. One step at a time. And I knew exactly where to start. The anger hit me in waves, but it wasn't the kind of rage that makes you act on impulse. No, this was different. This was a cold, calculated kind of anger. The kind that makes you think. The kind that gives you time to plan. And I had all the time in the world now. I wasn't going to just yell at Amina, or storm into Hassan's restaurant and throw punches. That wouldn't satisfy me. I didn't want a one-time release of anger. I wanted consequences. Slow, deliberate consequences. I wanted to break everything down, piece by piece. I wanted her to understand what she'd done, to feel the weight of it all, and I wasn't going to let her off easy. So I started to think. First, there was Hassan. He'd been the catalyst, the one who'd offered her a way out, a better life. But now, he was going to be the first to fall. I knew about his shady dealings, the things he'd been hiding beneath the surface. You could feel it every time you stepped into his restaurant. The way he'd talk about business, the whispers from his employees about dodgy payments and under-the-table deals. It wasn't hard to see the cracks. I wasn't just going to ruin his reputation. I was going to bring down his entire empire. I started gathering information. Quietly. I went into the restaurant a few times, acting like everything was fine. I didn't want to tip anyone off. I was still pretending to be the same Omar they all knew. But I was watching, listening, taking mental notes. The little details I had missed before, the odd financial transactions, the way Hassan would joke about paying off inspectors to keep things quiet, the staff who'd hinted at things they didn't want to say out loud. It wasn't long before I had enough to go on. I started to talk to some of his employees, under the guise of just being friendly. I didn't push them too hard, but they were all too eager to talk when I asked the right questions. Hassan wasn't just running a restaurant. He was running a business that skirted the law, and there were plenty of people ready to throw him under the bus for the right price. I took what I learned and started making moves. The first step was simple. I anonymously tipped off the authorities. Just enough to get their attention. A few calls, some carefully placed tips about illegal cash dealings and workers being exploited. Hassan had been too comfortable, too confident. He thought no one would question him. But now, I was going to make sure people did. I wasn't expecting things to happen overnight, but it didn't take long before the restaurant was raided. The police showed up one morning, and suddenly, everything changed. The news spread like wildfire. Customers started canceling reservations. Business began to tank. Employees who were caught up in Hassan's mess were arrested, their names on the news for things they didn't even know they were involved in. The scandal was enough to send ripples through the entire company, shaking the foundations of everything Hassan had built. But that wasn't the end of it. Oh no, I wasn't done yet. While Hassan was scrambling to save his business, I started digging into his personal life. I found out a few things that made me smile. A little extra cash from under-the-table payments to politicians, some shady dealings that even his most loyal employees didn't know about. It wasn't just the business that was at risk, it was his entire reputation, everything he thought he'd carefully built. I had all the information I needed. But I didn't make my next move just yet. I had to be patient. I had to wait for the right moment. Hassan would fall first, and Amina would follow, piece by piece. But I knew that wasn't enough. I didn't just want to bring them down professionally. I wanted to destroy everything they'd built, even their personal lives. I had to make her feel the consequences of her choices, and that meant hitting her where it would hurt the most. And so, the plan began to take shape. Slowly, methodically, I was going to make Amina's world crumble, just like mine had. I wasn't going to let her get away with this without feeling every ounce of pain she'd caused me. I had already started with Hassan. The next step was Amina. And I wasn't going to give her any mercy. Things started to unravel fast after the authorities raided Hassan's restaurant. The employees were caught off guard, confused, some even arrested. The place was shut down for days, and the backlash was immediate. People started talking, the rumors spread, and slowly, the walls started closing in on him. Customers, once loyal to his brand, began dropping off like flies, posting bad reviews, sharing what they'd heard. Hassan's perfect image was crumbling. But that wasn't all. While he was busy trying to clean up the mess, I wasn't finished yet. I kept the pressure on. I knew his employees were rattled, and some of them were desperate. One or two started to talk more openly. They didn't know me from Adam, but they had no idea how badly they were going to hurt him. I kept digging. The more I learned, the more I realized how corrupt the whole operation had been. There were shady deals with suppliers, workers being paid under the table, and even some illicit side businesses I hadn't expected. Hassan was too comfortable in his position, and I had everything I needed to bring him down, things he'd thought were hidden, tucked away in the shadows. I made sure I was always one step ahead. The moment I had the full picture, I took my next step. I started sending anonymous tips to investigative journalists, filling in the gaps, making sure the story was told the right way. I fed them just enough details to trigger a full-blown investigation, and soon, the media caught wind of it. News outlets picked up the story, and what had started as a small local scandal quickly turned into something bigger. By then, it was too late for Hassan. The news was everywhere. The restaurant was raided again, and the media had a field day. I made sure to keep the heat on, leaking more information every few days. Hassan's dirty laundry was aired for the whole world to see. Employees began coming forward, and their testimonies turned public opinion against him. The restaurant started losing patrons in droves. The brand was no longer the premium place it had once been. It was a place of scandal, corruption, and lies. Within weeks, his empire began to collapse. Some of his more loyal staff started quitting, no longer willing to stand by his side, while others turned on him, eager to save themselves. One by one, his properties were hit with fines, lawsuits, and investigations. Hassan's reputation was shattered, his restaurants were losing money, and the pressure was mounting. It wasn't long before he was forced to sell off some of his assets just to keep from sinking into bankruptcy. It was a public humiliation that, at this point, seemed inevitable. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning, though. Hassan wasn't just going to lose his business. He was going to lose everything. His credibility, his connections, his influence, gone. But the thing that gave me the most satisfaction, the realization that Amina was going to feel the heat too. She had fallen for a man who wasn't even worth the trouble. She had risked everything for a future that was already slipping through her fingers. Hassan wasn't the man he'd promised to be. He wasn't her escape. I couldn't wait for her to see it all fall apart. The longer she stayed with him, the harder the crash would be. I was setting her up for the same kind of destruction, piece by piece. She'd feel it, sooner or later. I wasn't done with her yet. And while Hassan scrambled to save what was left of his name, I sat back, watching his empire crumble. One lawsuit, one leak, one story at a time. But now, it was time for the real work to begin. The next step would be harder, messier, but it would be even more satisfying. I wasn't going to let Amina get away with it. She would feel the full force of her betrayal. It wasn't enough to watch Hassan's world burn. That was just the warm-up. The real devastation was going to come when I turned the screws on Amina. She needed to feel the weight of what she'd done, not just lose her marriage, but lose everything she'd thrown away for a man who wasn't even worth it. I had already filed for divorce, and while Amina was still pretending like nothing had changed, I could see the cracks beginning to show. The fight in her eyes had disappeared. She wasn't the same woman anymore. The woman who'd once fought for us was now playing a role in her own little drama, hiding behind a mask, pretending I didn't know. She had no idea what was coming for her. I started small, making sure to get all the financial details of our marriage in order. I made sure I was entitled to everything I could get in the divorce settlement. I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to give her a penny more than I had to. And the house. It wasn't even a question. I knew she loved that house, and I wasn't about to let her keep it. She'd used it as a symbol of everything she thought she deserved. Well, now she'd lose it. But it wasn't just about money. I wanted her to see how completely she had destroyed everything. She had thrown away a family, a life, a future for a man who could barely even keep his business afloat. It made me sick thinking about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to make sure she'd never forget it. I wanted her to understand the consequences of her choices in a way that would sting forever. I didn't just want to ruin her professionally. No, I wanted to humiliate her on every level. I made sure to gather information on her co-workers and a few of her closest friends, the ones who had known about the affair. I knew that once everything hit the fan, they would distance themselves from her, but I wanted to make sure they knew what she'd done, how deep her betrayal went. I wasn't going to let her hide behind that false image of herself anymore. So, I did what I had to do. I leaked information about her affair. Not directly. No, I wasn't going to risk a confrontation. I made sure to plant seeds in the right places. A well-timed anonymous message to her boss. A few quiet conversations with the right people. Slowly but surely, the rumors began to spread. First, it was whispers. Then, it was undeniable. Amina wasn't just the woman who had broken her marriage. She was the woman who had betrayed everyone around her. She had slept with a man who was married, my boss. She had slept with him while I was working myself to the bone just to keep us afloat. The whispers turned into judgment. Her co-workers started distancing themselves from her. Friends who had once supported her now looked at her like she was someone else. And with every word that got out, the consequences of her choices started to stack up. She wasn't just going to lose me. She was going to lose her reputation, her friends, and her place in the world she thought she deserved. Amina tried to put on a brave face, but I could see it. I saw the cracks forming, the stress, the shame. And that was just the start. As Hassan's empire continued to fall apart, I made sure that Amina knew exactly why it was happening. It wasn't just the business deals. It was because she had thrown everything away for a man who wasn't worth it. She had ruined herself for him. But the final blow came when I got involved with a major investor who was looking to buy out the remains of Hassan's failing empire. I made sure this investor was in it for a quick flip. Someone who didn't care about the long term, someone who'd buy out everything for pennies on the dollar, just to strip it down for profit. When the deal went through, Hassan found himself bankrupt. Everything he had built, gone. His name was mud. The businesses I'd once worked for, the empire he'd built on lies and deceit, crashed and burned. And Amina. She stood by him, even as the flames were rising. She thought she was going to escape, that somehow she could walk away from the wreckage without a scratch. But I made sure she didn't. The moment I signed the divorce papers, the house was mine. She would have nothing. Not only had she lost me, but she'd also lost any chance of that better life she thought she'd found with Hassan. The life she'd been promised was now nothing but ashes, just like everything else. As for me, I walked away stronger. I didn't need to tear her down further, but I wasn't going to let her get away with pretending she was the victim. I rebuilt my life, piece by piece. I started over. It wasn't easy, but I was doing it. And I was finally free. In the end, I didn't just get revenge. I got my dignity back. I got control of my life again. And Amina. Well, she learned the hard way that betrayal always comes with a price. As I moved forward, I wasn't even thinking about her anymore. What I had learned from all this was that revenge doesn't always feel like you expect. It wasn't about the anger. It wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming what was mine and getting back to a place where I didn't have to answer to anyone, especially not the woman who had tried to tear me apart. She thought she could destroy me. But in the end, she destroyed herself.